They're telling us a story that is completely and very much intentionally disconnected from reality. They're claiming that something called white supremacy, and that's a term they never define, is the single greatest threat we face, a greater threat than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Here's our thoroughly craven Attorney General telling us that very lie today.
In the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocated for the superiority of the white race.
We are living through the transformation of a formerly democratic republic into something else. We're looking at growing authoritarianism. That's not an overstatement. Vladimir Putin knows authoritarian systems very well, and he sees clearly what is happening in this country. Watch this.
Did you order Alexei Navalny's assassination?
Of course not. We don't have this kind of habit of assassinating anybody. That's one. Number two is, I want to ask you, did you order the assassination of the woman who walked into the Congress and who was shot and killed by a policeman? Do you know that 450 individuals were arrested after entering the Congress, and they didn't go there to steal a laptop? They came with political demands.
And why are all those January 6th protesters still in prison on trespassing charges, as so many Biden voters who torched federal buildings walking free? What's the answer to that question? If all of that was going on in Russia, we would rightly call it scary. We would call Putin a dictator. In fact, we do call him a dictator. And speaking of January 6th, why are there still so many things, basic factual matters, that we don't understand about that day? Why is the Biden administration preventing us from knowing? A new piece on Revolver.news suggests an answer to some of these questions. We know that the government is hiding the identity of many law enforcement officers who were present at the Capitol on January 6th, not just the one who killed Ashley Babbitt. According to the government's own court filings, those law enforcement officers participated in the riot, sometimes in violent ways. But strangely, some of the key people who participated on January 6th have not been charged. Look at the documents. The government calls those people unindicted co-conspirators. What does that mean? Well, it means that in potentially every single case, they were FBI operatives. Really? In the Capitol on January 6th. For example, one of those unindicted co-conspirators is someone government documents identify only as Person 2. According to those documents, Person 2 stayed in the same hotel room as a man called Thomas Caldwell, an insurrectionist, a man alleged to be a member of the group the Oath Keepers. Person 2 also, quote, stormed the barricades at the Capitol on January 6th alongside Thomas Caldwell. The government's indictments further indicate that Caldwell, who, by the way, is a 65-year-old man, this dangerous insurrectionist, was led to believe there would be a, quote, quick reaction force also participating on January 6th. That quick reaction force, Caldwell was told, would be led by someone called Person 3, who had a hotel room and an accomplice with him. But wait. Here's the interesting thing. Person 2 and Person 3 were organizers of the riot. The government knows who they are, but the government has not charged them. In all, Revolver News reported that there are, quote, upwards of 20 unindicted co-conspirators in the Oath Keeper indictments, all playing various roles in the conspiracy, who have not been charged for virtually the exact same activities, and in some cases, much, much more severe activities, as those named alongside them in the indictments. Because in March, the FBI director admitted that the Bureau is infiltrating as many dissident groups that oppose the regime as it possibly can.
There must be moments where you think, if we would have known, if we could have infiltrated this group or found out what they were doing. And that, do you have those moments?
So anytime there's an attack, especially one that's this horrific, that strikes right at the heart of our system of government, right at the time the transfer of power is being discussed, you can be darn tootin' that we are focused very, very hard on how can we get better sources, better information, better analysis, so that we can make sure that something like what happened on January 6th never happens again.
That's a line, and the FBI has crossed it. And it's not the first time they crossed that line in Michigan. Remember that plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer? We heard a lot about that, and Whitmer was able to cover some of her own incompetence, though not all, by pointing to the fact that she's now a victim. Now, in the FBI's telling of that plot, a whole team of insurrectionists was going to drive a van up to Gretchen Whitmer's vacation house and throw her in the back and drive away. The mastermind of this plot, according to the FBI, was a man called Adam Fox. Who is Adam Fox? Adam Fox turned out to be a homeless guy who was living in the basement of a vacuum repair shop. Quite a gorilla. The whole story was a farce. It was insulting, really, once you got to the details, which outlets like the AP didn't bother with in the first read. Remember the guy who suggested using a bomb to blow up a bridge as part of that plot? That got a lot of coverage. That guy was an undercover FBI agent. Trevor Aronson wrote a book on this called The Terror Factory, and it analyzed every terror prosecution from 2001 to 2013. Aronson found that at least 50 defendants were on trial because of behavior that the FBI had not only encouraged but enabled. FBI agents were essentially the plotters in these crimes. They made the crimes crimes. In 2012, a writer for The Nation called Petra Bartosiewicz found that FBI agents had, quote, crossed the line from merely observing potential criminal behavior, which, by the way, is allowed and good, to, and we're quoting, encouraging people and assisting people to participate in plots that are largely scripted by the FBI itself, end quote. One of those plots was an Islamic terror attack in 2015 in Garland, Texas. It turns out that an FBI employee played an active role in that shooting. A former FBI assistant director called Frank Figliuzzi explained the other day on MSNBC. The goal is to round up people who dissent against the regime and throw them into solitary, and that's including members of Congress. Watch this.
What have we learned from our experience with international terrorism? In order to address that problem, arresting low-level operatives is merely a speed bump, not a roadblock. In order to really tackle terrorism, and this time domestically, you've got to attack and dismantle the command and control element of a terrorist group. That may mean people sitting in Congress right now.
Happy Thursday, everybody. I trust everybody's had a good week. And I am very much looking forward to this particular episode. It's something that I read about, and then I watched Tucker Carlson on Tuesday, and I was just really looking forward to doing this. Revolver is a newer journalist media outlet. I'm not sure how long they have been around, but they have been doing some investigating about the January 6th Capitol siege, and we're going to take a look at it and just see what's going on with it. It's pretty disturbing. So, unindicted co-conspirators in January 6th cases raise disturbing questions of federal foreknowledge. Of all the questions asked, words spoken, and ink spilled on the so-called Capitol siege of January 6, 2021, none hold the key to the entire event quite like what Senator Amy Klobuchar asked of Christopher Wray. The Democrat from Minnesota asked the Trump-appointed FBI director, did the federal government infiltrate any of the so-called militia organizations claimed to be responsible for planning and executing the Capitol siege?
Encrypted two-way Chinese radio.
Oh.
And they show up, we now know, in this complaint with encrypted two-way Chinese radios in military gear, there must be moments where you think, if we would have known, if we could have infiltrated this group or found out what they were doing. And that, do you have those moments?
Absolutely. I will tell you, Senator, and this is something I feel passionately about, that anytime there's an attack, our standard at the FBI is we aim to bat 1,000, right? And we aim to thwart every attack that's out there. So anytime there's an attack, especially one that's this horrific, that strikes right at the heart of our system of government, right at the time transfer of power is being discussed, you can be darn tootin' that we are focused very, very hard on how can we get better sources, better information, better analysis, so that we can make sure that something like what happened on January 6th never happens again.
Okay.
Boy, darn tootin'. I can't stand people like that. Continuing on. Christopher Wray is able to uncomfortably weasel his way out of answering the question directly, partially because Klobuchar does him the courtesy of not asking him the question directly. Klobuchar instead asked the FBI director if he wishes he had infiltrated the militia organizations allegedly involved in January 6th, assuming from the outset that there was in fact no infiltration, thereby providing the FBI director an easy way to avoid addressing the question one way or another. Revolver News is willing to address the matter directly in the following 3 questions. First, in the year leading up to January 6th and during January 6th itself, to what extent were the 3 primary militia groups, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the 3 Percenters, that the FBI, DOJ, Pentagon, and Network News have labeled most responsible for planning and executing a Capitol attack on January 6th, infiltrated by agencies of the federal government or informants of said agencies? Exactly how many federal undercover agents or confidential informants were present at the Capitol or in the Capitol during the infamous siege, and what roles did they play? Merely passive informants or active instigators? And finally, of all the unindicted co conspirators referenced in the charging documents of those indicted for crimes on January 6th, how many worked as a confidential informant or as an undercover operative for the federal government, the FBI, Army, counterintelligence, etc.? So, from now on, all discussion of January 6th must give way to a laser like focus on the questions above with an unwavering persistence at obtaining the answers. If the narrative about January 6th does not conform to the questions above, the American people will never learn the most important truth about what January 6th is and what kind of country they're really living in. If it turns out the federal government did in fact have undercover agents or confidential informants embedded within the so-called militia groups indicted for conspiring to obstruct the Senate certification on January 6th, the implications would be nothing short of seismic, especially if such agents or informants enjoyed extremely senior level positions within such groups. One of the key consensus points among the FBI, DOJ, and the regime media is the idea that while January 6th is primarily the fault of Trump supporting QAnon infused domestic terrorists, it is secondarily the fault of so called intelligence failures. Klobuchar's own question at March 2nd, 2021 FBI hearing reinforces this intelligence failure narrative, but she is not alone. A 5-month bipartisan Senate investigation recently arrived at the very same intelligence failure narrative to explain the breach of the Capitol and associated events on January 6th. A bipartisan Senate investigation of the deadly I wish they wouldn't call it that because it wasn't deadly. It was only one person that died, Ashley Babbitt, and she was killed by Capitol Police. Unjustly, I think. So, but when they refer to it as deadly, it makes it sound like a whole lot of people died and they just didn't. On the January 6th insurrection, and I understand this is the document, so for sake of reading the document properly, I will call it an insurrection, but it was not an insurrection by far. A bipartisan Senate investigation of the deadly January 6th insurrection found security and intelligence failures at every level of government that led to the breach of the Capitol by a pro Trump mob as lawmakers in a joint session were certifying the 2020 election. The 95-page report, a product of a roughly 5-month joint probe by the Senate Homeland Security and Rules Committees, found significant breakdowns ranging from federal intelligence agencies failing to warn of a potential for violence to a lack of planning and preparation by U.S. Capitol Police and law enforcement leadership. There was no overall operational or staffing plan for that fateful day, a total failure of leadership, according to the committee. If it turns out that the federal government, the FBI, Army counterintelligence, or similar agency had undercover agents or confidential informants embedded in any of the groups involved in January 6th, the federal intelligence agencies failing to warn of a potential for violence looks less like an innocent mistake and more like something sinister. Indeed, if the federal government knew of a potential for violence in or around the Capitol on January 6th and failed to call for heightened security, the agencies responsible may in fact be legally liable for the damages incurred during that day. It is unsettling to entertain the possibility that the federal government knew of a potential for violence on January 6th and did nothing to stop it. It presents the question, why would agencies or certain elements within sit back and let something like this happen on purpose? Yeah, that bothers me a lot, let me tell you, because if you think about if they had known and they could have stopped it and they didn't, and then this resulted in Ashley Babbitt's death because they refused to stop it because whatever reason they wanted to make Trump look bad, Trump supporters look bad, create this whole false narrative. They cost somebody their life. Not that the left really cares about lives, they don't. The life doesn't have intrinsic value to them. But if that is the case, they're responsible for Ashley Babbitt's death. They're already responsible, but they are so much more responsible. And if I were her husband, I would, if this comes to light to be true and it can be proven, not only would I be suing DC Capitol Police, but I would be suing the FBI and whoever else was involved to make this happen. That's just me. A still more disturbing possibility arises from a careful study of the unindicted co-conspirators listed throughout the various charging documents of individuals facing the most serious charges related to January 6th. We at Revolver News have noticed a pattern from our now months-long investigation into January 6th, and in particular from our meticulous study of the charging documents related to those indicted. In many cases, the unindicted co-conspirators appear to be much more aggressive and egregious participants in the very so-called conspiracy, serving as a basis for charging those indicted. The question immediately arises as to why this is the case, and forces us to consider whether certain individuals are being protected from indictment because they were involved in January 6th as undercover operatives or confidential informants for a federal agency. Here it is useful to draw a distinction between two discrete categories of participants in the so-called Capitol siege. The first category is the group of mostly harmless tourists who walked through already opened doors and already removed barricades, and at most were guilty of minor trespassing charges and light property offenses. The second group consists of those who were violent with police officers, broke down barricades, smashed windows, belonged to a militia group engaged in military-style planning prior to the event, discussed transporting heavy weaponry, and so forth. Up until now, the overwhelming, perhaps exclusive share of counter-establishment reporting on January 6th has focused on absolving the first group, and this is a valuable thing. The notion that these harmless MAGA moms wandering around the Capitol were domestic terrorists engaged in an insurrection is absurd. That many of these people are being held in prison without bail under harsh conditions amounts to an unacceptable and outrageous abuse of basic human rights. However, the possibility that the federal government had undercover operatives or informants involved in the events of January 6th, from its planning to its execution, compels us to turn our attention to the second category of participants. We are especially interested in the unindicted co-conspirators who belong to any of the big three militia groups: the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the Three Percenters. Indeed, it is these militia groups whose behavior, statements, and planning leading up to and during January 6th most closely align with the violent insurrectionist caricature we hear about in the media, and which the government claims to be going after in its aggressive prosecutions. If it turns out that an extraordinary percentage of the members of those groups involved planning and executing the Capitol siege were federal informants or undercover operatives, the implications would be nothing short of staggering. This would be far worse than the already bad situation of the government knowing about the possibility of violence and doing nothing. Instead, this would imply that elements of the federal government were active instigators in the most egregious and spectacular aspects of January 6th, amounting to a monumental entrapment scheme used as a pretext to imprison otherwise harmless protesters at the Capitol, and in a much larger sense, used to frame the entire MAGA movement as potential domestic terrorists. This is what's at stake in getting to the bottom of January 6th. And so we proceed, unafraid to investigate the questions on which everything else pertaining to January 6th hinges. Did the government have informants or undercover agents in any or all of the three big militia groups leading up to or on January 6th? How many of the key unindicted co-conspirators in DOJ prosecutions are unindicted because they are undercover operatives or confidential informants? In short, what did the federal government know in advance about January 6th? When did they know it, and how far did any undercover operations go? Yeah. Um, I don't put it past our government or even people in our government to do stuff like that. We have a bunch of corrupt, greedy, power hungry people in our government, so I don't put it past them, but also because we already know that they've done it before. Um, we didn't know it to begin with, but we know now that they've already done this. And it's the forgotten case of the Whitmer kidnapping plot. So, of course, we could point to countless examples in America's history of undercover agents and informants being actively involved in various domestic terror plots. But for the purposes of the argument we're making here, we need only go back a few months prior to January 6th to the so called Whitmer kidnapping plot. Indeed, what if we told you that scarcely 3 months before the January 6th Capitol siege, the FBI arrested 14 people for planning to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and overthrow the state government, and that the alleged conspiracy to overthrow the state government involved storming of the state capitol? And what if we told you that of the 14 individuals who allegedly plotted the kidnapping and overthrow of the state government, at least 5 were undercover agents and federal informants? And as if that's not enough, many of the individuals allegedly involved in this plot appear to belong to the Three Percenters, one of the very same militia groups now blamed for storming January 6th. And as the cherry on top, what if we told you that the director of the Detroit FBI field office, who oversaw the infiltration operation of the Michigan plot, was subsequently granted a highly coincidental promotion to the D.C. office, where he is now the lead FBI agent for all January 6th cases? As crazy as it sounds, all of this is true. A full account of the Michigan plot and its parallels to the Capitol siege runs outside the scope and purposes of this article. Nonetheless, it will be useful to briefly flesh out some of the most salient details alluded to above. Did I say that right? Salient? Okay. The left wing blog Jacobin, of all places, provides a good description of the allegation and charges. Since last week, the headlines have been lit up by a shocking story out of Michigan. The FBI had foiled a plot hatched by anti lockdown protesters and right wing militia members to kidnap and try for treason Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who one of the ringleaders called a tyrant, and I don't cuss, so the B word. According to the federal affidavit and court testimony, the plot involved in surveilling Whitmer's vacation home in western Michigan and the surrounding area, procuring explosives and tactical gear to fight off police, taking part in armed training exercises, and even possibly blowing up a nearby bridge. The alleged plotters discussed using a fake pizza delivery to kidnap Whitmer, leaving Whitmer on a boat in the middle of Lake Michigan, and even kidnapping Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, one of the tyrants who they believed were abusing their power to order statewide lockdowns in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Drawing upon entrapment cases used in the War on Terror, the Jacobin piece expresses concerns that the whole Michigan plot itself may have been the result of entrapment of vulnerable, cognitively deficient, and mentally unstable individuals by FBI informants. The following passage discusses the pathetic state of Adam Fox, the man designated by the government as the mastermind of the kidnapping plot. According to the FBI's affidavit, the Bureau made heavy use of informants and undercover agents in this case. At least 4 took part, specifically 2 informants and 2 undercover agents, on whose evidence gathering the criminal complaint was based on, though it's implied that some unspecific number of additional personnel were involved. And as with earlier Muslim targeting cases, the FBI appears to have been integral to the plotter's ability to carry out the scheme. The affidavit notes that an undercover agent told the ringleader it would cost $4,000 to procure explosives. 4 of the accused planned to meet with another undercover agent posing as an explosives expert to pay for them, and they were told to get some excess tactical gear the agent had the day they were arrested. In court, Richard Trask, the agent who authored the affidavit, said he didn't know how much money the defendants had on them when they were put in handcuffs, aside from the $275 held by Adam Fox, pegged by Trask as the ringleader. Even the profile of Fox is not unlike those of earlier targets like Sharif and Hester. Fox was reportedly struggling with money and had been on the brink of homelessness after his girlfriend kicked him out of her house before being taken in by his friend and employer, who let him stay temporarily in the basement of his vacuum store. It was there in that cramped storage space cluttered with boxes and spare vacuum parts, where Fox was living with his 2 dogs and meager possessions, that he at one point held a meeting to allegedly plan out the kidnapping. The possibility of an FBI entrapment type operation is especially disturbing in light of the striking parallels between the Michigan plot and the so-called Capitol siege. The Michigan plot did not start out as kidnapping. According to the DOJ's own indictment, the plot started as a plan to storm the Capitol building in Lansing, Michigan, and the conspirators would do so by amping up at least 200 men from an upcoming unrelated rally planned at the Michigan Capitol building, a rally that was focused on the Second Amendment, not insurrection, by agitating enough rallygoers to run inside and occupy the building. Paragraph 10 of the FBI affidavit describes the plot to storm the state capitol. Fox, in coordination with Croft, met with members of the militia group at various times in June 2020. During one such meeting, a June 18, 2020, which was audio recorded by CHS-2, Fox militia group leader, including Michigan resident Ty Garbin, and CHS-2 met at a Second Amendment rally at the state capitol in Lansing, Michigan, in an effort to recruit more members for the operation. Fox told Garbin and CHS-2 he planned to attack the Capitol and asked them to combine forces. CHS-2 refers to a confidential human source, which means government informant. As mentioned above, the groups involved with this alleged plot were absolutely replete with undercover informants and operatives. Consider the following excerpt from the same FBI affidavit. In the course of its investigation, the FBI relied on information provided by confidential human sources and undercover employees over several months. Not all CHSs and UCEs were present at all times. However, at least one CHS or UCE was usually present during the group meetings. Those CHSs and UCEs consensually recorded the meetings and conversations with the subjects. Some meetings or conversations were recorded by more than one CHS or UCE. Certain CHSs also had access to group or individual text, online chats, and phone calls. Each CHS was vetted for reliability by the FBI agent handling the source. None of the CHSs were aware of the other CHSs involved with the group in order to preserve the independence of their reporting. Although multiple CHSs were used over the course of the investigation, this complaint only relies on audio recordings and information provided by CHS-1, CHS-2, UCE-1, and UCE-2. In the above excerpt, the FBI acknowledges the use of both confidential informants and undercover employees over the course of several months leading up to that so-called thwarted plot. Specifically, the complaint acknowledges 2 confidential informants and 2 undercover employees. Subsequent to the DOJ's filing charges, however, another deep undercover informant unexpectedly outed himself, bringing the tally of known government operatives up to 5. And then I think these are some of the people that were involved in the plot: Pete Musico, Paul Bellar, and Joseph Morrison. So, no wonder this Michigan plot didn't take the federal authorities by surprise. Yeah. FBI infiltrators comprise at the very least 26% of the plotters. That is, at least 5 FBI operatives have been disclosed against just 14 suspects indicted. A look at the annotated indictment reveals that at every level of the plot, FBI operatives played the most important leadership roles. The plot's explosive expert, who the plotters were accused of planning to buy bombs from, turned out to be an FBI agent. The head of transportation for the militia outfit turned out to be an undercover FBI agent. The head of security for the militia outfit turned out to be an undercover FBI informant. At least 2 undercover FBI informants were active participants in the initial June 6, 2020 meeting in which the plot to storm Capitol buildings was allegedly hatched, meaning at least 3 FBI informants infiltrated before the conspiracy even started. So they were already infiltrating this group before they had ever talked about kidnapping or even uh, storming the Capitol on January 6th. I couldn't think of the word. In one of the plot's climatic scenes, in the main van driving up to look at Governor Whitmer's vacation home, 3 out of the 5 people in the van, 60% of the plot's senior leaders, were federal agents and informants. Fox, Croft, CHS2, a UCE, and an individual from Wisconsin traveled in the first vehicle. While in the vehicle, Croft and Fox discussed detonating explosive devices to divert police from the area of the vacation home. They stopped at the M31 highway bridge on the way, where Fox and the UCE inspected the underside of the bridge for places to seat an explosive charge. Fox took a picture of the bridge's support structure, which he later shared with CHS2 in their encrypted chat. From there, they drove to a public boat launch across the lake from the vacation home to watch for the other cars in their group. You may be wondering, how do you get 3 out of 5 when the DOJ's complaint only acknowledges 2 undercover FBI operatives? That is because the FBI went to great lengths to hide their affiliation with the 5th person in the van, describing him only as an individual from Wisconsin. Let's take stock of what we have so far. We have a group of plotters that is heavily infiltrated by FBI informants and undercover agents who were allegedly planning to kidnap the Michigan governor and storm the state capitol. What we also know is that many of the main figures indicted in this plot seem to be associated with the militia group called the Three Percenters, one of the very same Big Three militia groups primarily charged with orchestrating January 6th. Just to take a few examples, the FBI alleged Adam Fox and Barry Croft were the supposed masterminds of the plot, with Adam Fox described as the Michigan state leader of the Three Percenters and Barry Croft as a national leader of the Three Percenters. The FBI secured a search warrant to tap National 3%ers leaders Barry Croft's Facebook account in April 2020, 2 months before the Michigan plot was even allegedly hatched. So they're already spying on this guy before this plot ever comes to the forefront. No one's thought of it yet. And clearly they're looking at his stuff because they don't like his dissenting opinion. For almost the entirety of 2020, every time Barry Croft's Facebook account got banned, the FBI would tap each new alt account he created under a new warrant. Michigan plot indicted co-conspirators Brian Higgins and Michael Knoll were identified as 3%ers as well, as was Michael Jung, who was not indicted in relation to the kidnapping plot. Jung allegedly was a member of both the Oath Keepers and second in command of the Wisconsin branch of the 3%ers. Jung's 2-acre homestead in Wisconsin was where the DOJ alleges the Michigan plotters held firearms training and field exercises under the watchful eye of undercover informants. And so we see the strange parallels between the so-called Michigan plot and the so-called January 6th Capitol siege. In Michigan, you had an alleged plot involving the storming of a state capitol, allegedly involving members of one of the very same key militia groups associated with the January 6th plot. And we're supposed to believe that despite massive and now publicly confirmed FBI and government infiltration of the Michigan plot, there was no similar infiltration for January 6th. Such a position appears still less plausible when we consider a final suspicious connection between the Michigan plot and January 6th. I told y'all this was kind of long. The head of the FBI office in Detroit, Stephen D'Antuono, I guess that's how you say it, I'm not sure, who oversaw the infiltration and incitement operation into the Michigan plot, was quickly and quietly promoted to lead the coveted Washington, D.C. D.C. field office. So Stephen M. D'Antuono, who was named chief of the Detroit FBI office a year ago, has been promoted to head the Washington field office, a coveted post in the bureau. FBI Director Christopher Wray made the announcement Tuesday, just several days after D'Antuono's agents and state police busted up a plot to abduct Governor Gretchen Whitmer. His official new title is Assistant Director in Charge. If you've been following along so far, you can probably take a guess as to what Stephen D'Antuono is up to in his new coveted perch. That's right, he's one of the key figures overseeing the investigation into the January 6th Capitol siege. What a coincidence! Let's recap what we've established. Just months prior to the U.S. Capitol siege on January 6th, the FBI thwarted a similar plot involving a siege at the Michigan State Capitol, whose plotters belonged to one of the three main militia groups associated with January 6th. The FBI was able to thwart this on the basis of an astonishing infiltration rate of said groups involving undercover operatives and informants who had been working in such capacity just in one tiny Michigan network for more than 7 months. They were so well infiltrated that they already had 3 informants embedded in this random 3%er network before any plot was even hatched. Furthermore, just days after the plot was foiled, FBI Director Christopher Wray quietly promoted the FBI special agent in charge of the Michigan plot operation to a coveted D.C. field post where he now oversees the investigation into January 6th. The special agent in charge, by the way, is who establishes, extends, renews, and supervises all FBI undercover operations. The above parallels between the Michigan plot and January 6 do not necessarily mean that the FBI had undercover informants and operatives who were involved in January 6, but it sure as heck reinforces our intuition that it's a distinct possibility. And it forces us to ask the question once again, if the government foiled the Michigan plot, why didn't they step in to stop the so-called siege on January 6th? It is now imperative for anyone who cares about the truth to demand that Christopher Wray answer the question. To what extent did the FBI or any other government agency infiltrate the key militia groups associated with the U.S. Capitol siege? And more pressing still, a question to which we now turn our attention, how many of the unindicted co-conspirators in January 6 prosecutions are unindicted on account of a prior arrangement with the federal government as an undercover operative or informant? Revolver News investigative team noticed from the very beginning a highly unusual and hard to explain feature of the conspiracy indictments filed against the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. Revolver took special notice of not only the unusual volume of unindicted co-conspirators, but a still more unusual feature that the statements and actions of the unindicted co-conspirators in many cases seemed far more egregious and aggressive than those of the persons actually indicted. It is essential here to make an important note of clarification. The purpose of this analysis here is not to aid in the prosecution of any of these unindicted co-conspirators. Rather, our aim is to point out that given the standards of indictment applied to those actually indicted, it is very strange and indeed suspicious that certain unindicted co-conspirators have managed to avoid indictment. This does not necessarily mean that we approve of the standard of indictment itself. Quite the contrary, the aggressive standard of indictment and prosecution through an unimaginably broad application of conspiracy charges is immoral, unjust, and absurd. We hope that one consequence of this seismic expose will be a serious and prompt reform of the justice system to prevent such aggressive and politically motivated prosecutions on the part of the government. Broadly speaking, there are 3 primary reasons to see an unindicted co-conspirator in a criminal complaint: grants of immunity, pragmatic considerations, and evidentiary concerns. Grants of immunity are traditionally only issued as the result of a plea deal reached between a defendant and a prosecutor, specifically in exchange for agreeing to testify against big fish in the conspiracy. A little fish may remain an unindicted co-conspirator and never be charged. But there are 2 reasons this possibility is far less likely in the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys indictments. First, the timing doesn't add up. The first indictment in the Oath Keepers case, already containing multiple key unindicted co-conspirators, was filed on January 27th. The first superseding indictment was filed on February 19th. The second superseding indictment was filed on March 12th. The third superseding indictment was filed on March 31st. but the first plea deal in the Oath Keepers case was not struck until April 16th. This means that none of the unindicted co-conspirators in the first 3 months of filings could have gotten a grant of immunity. And even then, only one guy so far has copped a plea. Informal plea negotiations among the broader group didn't even start until last week. There are what appears to be upwards of 20 unindicted co-conspirators in the Oath Keepers indictments, all playing various roles in the conspiracy, who have not been charged for virtually the exact same activities, and in some cases much, much more severe activities, as those named alongside them in indictments. The timeline and fact pattern suggests, therefore, that the only unindicted co-conspirator who could be unindicted as a result of a grant of immunity would have to be the single person from the fourth superseding indictment onward, which was filed on May 26th. The other reasons to typically see unindicted co-conspirators, pragmatic concerns, and evidentiary concerns, seem far less likely in this case as well. The DOJ kicked off what has become one of the largest and most aggressive prosecutorial dragnets in American history by announcing a campaign of shock and awe. No one gets off the hook, no one gets leniency, and everyone playing a big part gets maximum time, because this is about sending a message. So this was the acting U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Michael Sherwin, and he described the shock and awe. And you can go watch the video on YouTube, or you can go look up my episode. I think it was uh it was a few episodes ago, about Republicans are the criminals now, something like that. Innocent till proven Republican or conservative, something like that. It's only a few episodes ago. You can go watch that and you can see all those clips. But he did say, I wanted to ensure, and our office wanted to ensure, that there was shock and awe that we could charge as many people as possible before January 20th. And it worked, because we saw through media posts that people were afraid to come back to DC, because they were like, if we go there, we're going to get charged. We saw shock and awe in action in the DOJ's terrifyingly twisted conspiracy case against George Tanios, discussed at length in a previous Revolver report. And I know the report continues on about George Tanios or Tanios. I'm not sure how you say it. Obviously, I'm not going to read that. It has nothing really to do with this. But if you want, you can go to revolvernews.com. It's the top article on the website to check it out and continue reading for yourself. But to close this out for the day, this is ridiculous. And I can't really express it enough that we have got to start fighting back. Stop being so afraid to stand up. I've said it many times before. What do you have to lose? Doesn't matter what they think about you. They already hate you. And you have to fight back. And our country is worth fighting for and sacrificing for. It is. It's worth it. So we should be fighting back. I'm not going to go into the huge rant of why we need to and how we should do it. I do those constantly. But what I do want to say is that I hope that you enjoyed this episode, that it was informative. Go look up the documents, the court documents where they were charging these people, so you can see the indictments. I don't know where those are. I couldn't find them, but I'm not the best at searching things up on the internet either. That might be why. If I do come across them, I'll link them to my Facebook page so people can look at them. And um, but just check it out for yourself and see what you think. I think it's possible that they had infiltrated and that they knew that this was going to happen, and they refused to stop it. They chose to let it continue. So I have a big problem with that. Anyway, please join me on my Facebook, Lauren Collins. I just gotta say something. You can email me at gotta say something21@gmail.com. If you want to do an audio listen, or listen to the audio only, you can find me on Anchor, Pandora, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, there's so many platforms that have my show on there. Also, you can check me out on YouTube. I just got to say something, and I would really appreciate it if you would please like and subscribe and share this video, share it with everybody. It would mean a lot to me. And as always, check out The Scott Ford Show, Isaac Hayes with The Cajun Conservative and Brothers Just Searching, Christy at The Lennar Score and her YouTube channel, Christy's Closet, and TV's Rob is Unwoke. These are all great people. Please check out their stuff and subscribe and like, leave ratings, whatever. Leave a comment. Also, you can leave me a comment and just say hi if you'd like to. So, this is the end today, and I hope that you'll be back at my next episode. God bless.